What would you say for a woman who's listening to this who wants to build some muscle, make sure she's also improving her body compositions, not gaining too much fat? Like, what are a few rules you think everybody should follow?
Really trying to focus on getting 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. And we want to distribute that evenly throughout the day. So it's not like having a big whack of protein in the morning and then kind of scuttling off throughout the rest of the day. It's really making sure that you're getting 40-ish grams at breakfast, 40-ish grams at lunch, and 40 or 50 grams at dinner. Also, taking an eye that you want a lot of colorful fruit and veg as your carbohydrate, and you can accent that with what we call the 20% rule. So that's where your protein Pop Tart comes into play if you wanted it, you know. So it's the protein and the fiber that become really important when we're looking to fuel well and to build muscle and prevent that body fat from coming on.
And then what do you think about like the difference between different proteins, like animal versus plant protein? I know there's been a lot of debate over that over the years. I think that, sometimes if people don't like certain types of animal protein, it becomes incredibly hard to get it from plants unless they're super strategic about it. What is your advice on like the best sources of protein?
Well, when we look from like a rating perspective, we see the egg white is at that 100 mark. Whey protein isolate dairy products are above it, and then we start to see pea protein isolate below it. When we're talking about animal versus plant, I might get slammed for this. It doesn't really matter, right? What we're looking at is the quality of the protein. So, yes, protein supplementation from powders is fine, but you don't want that to be your mainstay. If you're looking at trying to get protein in as a vegan or someone who's plant based, you want to make sure that you're getting lots of different types of fruit and veg that also have protein in it. So it can be your sprouted grain bread with peas, green peas, nuts, seeds. Maybe you have a tempeh sandwich. In the morning, you're having chia seeds and oats that have been soaked in some oat milk or almond milk, and then you're adding some nuts and some berries and stuff. So it's not about going for that big, meat and 2 veg. It's about looking at all the spectrum and making sure that you're getting protein from a whole bunch of different sources that fill up your plate.
Going low carb, carnivore, keto, etc., has become more popular over the last few years, specifically like carnivore, like eating like zero carbs, like zero vegetables, and just eating straight up meat. Talk about the dangers of that from a hormonal perspective for women.
Oh my gosh, I look at that and I think, oh, your poor gut. Because the gut microbiome is so important, right? And we see that part of how hormones are regulated for women is through what we call a second pass. So that means hormone metabolites are bound in the liver and then shot into the gut and then unconjugated or removed from sex hormone binding globulin by our gut bugs and then shot back out. If we don't have diversity or we have a very low amount of these gut bugs, then we have hormone dysfunction. We're not optimizing our hormones. When we start looking at other things that our gut microbiome does with regards to vitamin production, the gut brain axis, with regards to mood, to serotonin, we see 95% of our serotonin is made in the gut. There's lots of disruption that comes from neurotransmitters and hormones when we don't take care of our gut microbiome. So if we're having no fiber or very limited fiber, then we are reducing the diversity of the gut microbiome. And the longitudinal aspect of having a very low diversity is poor health.
And so, what do you tell the person that's like, well, I need to cut out all carbs so I can lose body fat?
I look at them and go, well, actually, no, women need carbs. And you're not going to be able to lose body fat if you don't have carbs because your body is looking for a carbohydrate in order to fuel mitochondria to be able to use free fatty acids at rest and during exercise. We also see that the carbs from fruit and veg are very powerful anti-inflammatory, antioxidative agents. And we start having a misstep in our estrogen, we need those because estrogen is a powerful anti-inflammatory agent. And we need that in order for the liver to understand free fatty acids shouldn't become visceral fat. So we look at carbohydrate intake. It's not about the white breads. It's not about the simple carbs. It's about the kinds of foods that you're eating that provide the fiber for your gut. And the other thing with regards to body composition is we see in the 4 to 5 years before that one point in time menopause, There's a significant decrease in the gut microbiome diversity, and this is directly related to an increase in body fat and decrease in lean mass. So we have to be very cognizant of taking care of that gut microbiome. And the way we do that is with fiber, and fiber comes from carbohydrate rich sources.
How do you view time restricted feeding as it pertains to women? How do you believe, based on the research, that women should do it effectively so that they're not crushing their hormones in a negative way or negatively impacting their health?
The bottom line is an overnight fast, which is using the buzzwords. You have that 12-hour, if you have a higher cancer risk, than 13 to 14-hour overnight fast. So it could be 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. But the really important thing is that you are having some food within a half an hour of waking up, because it's important to signal the hypothalamus, that is the control center for so many metabolic processes, that there is nutrition coming in. When we start looking at the research on intermittent fasting and comparing it to calorie restriction, they see that there's no difference in weight loss between the two. It's just some people find doing fasting is easier with regards to restricting calories. But the caveat there is, when you look at the research, they don't account for the quality of the food that's in the eating window. So when we're looking at all these warrior or long fasting episodes and short eating windows, people are trying to get as many calories as they can in there, but they're not paying attention to the quality. Whereas if we look at time restricted eating, which is that overnight fast, or, having a set time where you're not eating, preferably, like I said, overnight, then the time that you are eating is focusing on the quality. So when you're reading the literature, there's a difference between time restricted eating and fasting based on what is happening in that eating window.
Got it. And then what about like fasting around the menstrual cycle? Like I know, you've talked about how women can optimize their nutrition and their strength training around the timing of their cycle. What is your like updated position on that, and how can people do it in a way that's going to improve the way they manage things?
One critical factor that I've been noticing, and why my thought process has changed a little bit, is ovulation. We're seeing an incredible upsurge of anovulatory cycles, meaning you don't have ovulation, in just the general population. And in the athletic population, it's becoming a massive issue. If you don't ovulate, you don't produce progesterone and you don't have an estrogen surge. So if you don't have that, you have a pretty stable hormone profile. You will have a bleed with an anovulatory cycle, so you can't really tell if you have an anovulatory cycle or not. So when we start talking about fasting around the menstrual cycle, there's no real rhyme or reason to it. There's no evidence to say that you should be, even if you are ovulating. And when you think about it, it's the time leading up to ovulation, the body's becoming very stress resilient. So you need nutrition to be stress resilient, to have a good immune system. Post ovulation, your body's building tissue. It's all about building endometrial lining, and it has an increase in the calorie and food needs, particularly carbohydrate and protein. So neither one of those makes sense to be fasting around it. We talk about tracking menstrual cycle as becoming more of that individual basis. It's like, your own patterns, and you can see changes in bleed patterns. You see changes in how you feel. Then you can change your training around that. But we don't want people to blanket say, I'm going to do this to this phase, and then I'm going to take 2 weeks off. It was never our intent to say that. It was, we want to, make sure that you're able to push when your body is stress resilient, and we want you to be able to kind of bring it down or deload a little bit right before you have your period, because your body's not very stress resilient at all.
So specifically, what do you think are a few like minor shifts people can make around that time that could also maybe be implemented for the rest of the month, so that it's not something drastic where they're doing it for a week or two and then going back to a completely different routine afterwards?
It's pretty boring, but it's the same thing. It's, you stop eating dinner 2 to 3 hours before bed, and you fuel during the day. You fuel for what you are doing. It's not about holding food until noon and then having food. It's really listening to fueling when your body needs it. And a lot of people say, well, I'm not hungry till 10 or 11. Well, you've been conditioned not to be that way because you've spent this whole time like just drinking coffee and water and then not having food until noon. Your body is conditioned to that, but you can reteach it. You can learn hunger cues, and we want to fuel during the day and not eat late. And so we can have really good recovery overnight. And if you hold that across all cycles, all hormone profiles, all age groups, it works on so many different molecular levels into the whole body. And we see really good longevity outcomes from that.
Right. I want to dive into cardio more when it comes to like, women specifically. Like, what do you think, like, from a blanket perspective, are the most like effective forms of cardio for women? And obviously, if you think it's different based on their age, I mean, I'd love for you to go into that as well.
Yeah, when we're looking at the younger age group, like I said, you can get away with a lot of things. If you want to do two F45 classes back to back, go for it. But when you start getting older, you need to be very acutely aware of how to polarize. So we want to do true high intensity work, or we want to do true sprint interval work, because we have to be able to capitalize on these external stressors to now create adaptations. I have a lot of endurance athletes that are like, well, what about wanting to do a 3 day bike packing tour? Or maybe I have some gravel races coming up, or I'm training for a marathon, or I'm training for a 10K or an ultra. I'm not saying to completely mark that off. I'm saying that the bread and butter of what you should be doing as you get older is quality training, not volume. So if you are training for an ultra, it's not the old school of running 20 hours a week. It's let's look at how we are building strength, how we're doing some top end work, and then we spend time on our feet every 10 to 15 days where we go out for 2 really long days at a time. So there's ways of peppering in endurance, but the benchmark is doing that polarized training and strength training. When we're younger, like I said, you can get away with a lot of stuff. You can go for lots of endurance stuff. You can do lots of high intensity work. You can play around with a whole bunch of different things. But as you get older, we have to have that eye to how are we polarizing our training so that we get better blood glucose control, so we get better conversation between the skeletal muscle and the liver so that we don't store visceral fat. How do we have better conversations to create epigenetic changes so that we maintain the quality of our muscle and the quality of our bone? Because those are so key in being able to live independently as we get older.
Right. And I know you're not a fan of doing like things like fasted strength training, but what about like if somebody wants to go for like a walk in the morning fasted? Do you think that there's benefit to that? Do you think there's not a benefit? Like, what are your thoughts?
From a mindfulness perspective, yeah, people get out first thing in the morning in nature. That's great. If they're doing any kind of intensity, then it starts to create a disruption that causes catabolism. That and the first thing to go is lean mass. And like I said, it's really hard for women to build mass, really hard for women to keep it. So if you're going to go do something that's long and fasted, that's going to be counterproductive and stimulate the body to break it down, you just want to have a pause and think about that.
Right. So you don't think there's benefits for like fat loss if people are doing fasted cardio? I mean, I know that's been kind of debunked. I feel like over the last probably 5 years, I've seen it. There's been a lot of research against it, but I mean, I know that was like an old thing people used to do to burn fat. Like,
Yeah, and it comes down to women are already really efficient fat burners because we have those sex differences from birth where women have more endurance oriented oxidative fibers. We have better mitochondria, better respiration. We have better metabolic flexibility. So all of these things that come up as go for fasted training, go for a fasted walk for fat burning are all if you're a guy. If you're a guy, you want to become more like a woman, sweet. Go do all your fasted stuff. Then you'll become very endurant and metabolically flexible like women. But for women, it doesn't do the same.
gotcha. From like a longevity perspective, I know like the biggest thing that you've been stressing or pushing in the conversation has been like strength training and making sure you have quality muscle as you age. Are there any other things you think are important for women to focus on to make sure that they're living not just longer, but a better quality of life as they get older?
Yeah, a big thing that comes up is joint and joint issues. We see a lot of inflammation, soft tissue injuries, joint pain, joint issues. So this is where the mobilization and mobility come into work. Kelly and Juliet Starr are good friends of mine, and I love their Ready State and all their mobility work that they do because it's so critical for maintaining joint integrity. So when women start getting into perimenopause and having plantar fascia issues, frozen shoulder, joint issues, it's all about taking care of that soft tissue around the joint. And that's where mobility comes into play. So, really working on mobility to maintain range of motion and reduce any kind of sticky point of soft tissues as you get older.
Things like sauna, cold water exposure, cryotherapy, stuff like that has become widely popular over recent years as well. What are your thoughts on that as it relates to what we're talking about?
It's like the icing, right? We want everyone to look at all their lifestyle stuff. But if you're going to go down the route of using environmental stuff, which is fantastic, near and dear to me because I'm an environmental physiologist, we have to look at the different sex differences in responses. So something like cryotherapy, way too cold for women. If we look at cold water immersion, you want to be around 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. That's cold enough for women to invoke all the metabolic and parasympathetic responses. Because if you get into the really cold stuff, it causes too much of a vasoconstrictive response. And then it's a threat to the body and you don't get the same benefit. If you look at the sauna, everyone responds well to the sauna. Everyone responds well to the heat. We see cardiovascular adaptations, we see hormone changes, we see better blood glucose control. So if you have to pick, of course, I'll push people to the sauna. But a lot of people are like, I don't like to heat. And you're still going to get all the parasympathetic responses too. Yeah, there is some benefit in the cold as long as it's not too cold. And there's definitely benefit for sauna exposure and heat exposure.
So, as somebody who's an environmental physiologist, like what factors do you think play the biggest role in women regarding their health, aging, etc.?
I think we live in a society that is too comfortable. We all have air conditioning, we have heat, we, don't want to go out if it's raining. We never challenge ourselves. I think the biggest thing that women can do is have a challenge every day. So either it's a mental challenge or it's a physical challenge. We're looking at environmental challenges as well. We have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable because we live in a society that just makes everything so in a box that the body is never challenged.
From a supplementation perspective, what are your thoughts on supplements for women? What are some, generally speaking, that you think are effective? What are some that are being pushed that you think are ineffective?
If we look at the performance side of supplementation, there's been some really fantastic reviews and audits that come out and show that almost nothing in the supplement world has been tested or work on women.
Really? That's interesting. So, nothing, no supplements?
So we look at protein powders, yes, for sure. We look at beta alanine, yes, that works too. There's good research for that. We look at creatine, definitely, from health and performance standpoint. But then we look at something like nitrates. Nitrates, it's a double-edged sword. So we see that in younger women who are still in their reproductive years, it actually decreases performance, decreases VO, and has a counter effect. But for women who are postmenopausal, it has benefit. It causes vasodilation and it actually does have a benefit. And it has to do with estrogen because estrogen is tied to the nitric oxide cycle that is responsible for blood vessel and blood vessel control. When we look at things like vitamin D, yes, it works. It works with a timing effect where we want to have it after training to help reduce hepcidin so that we can have optimal iron. But then we start looking at all the other things that are out there, and there really isn't very much robust research for women and very small amount of research for men.
And so you think mostly it's all overhyped, except for protein, creatine, beta alanine, essentially everything else you think is just a waste of people's money?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, it's an individual case by case basis, right? So if you find something and it works for you, great. The exception, of course, is adaptogens because that's a completely different category than general supplements. So, yeah, I mean, I get questions all the time about all these things that come up for mitochondrial health or for mobilizing fat. And you look and it's been done on rats, but it hasn't been done on people.
And so, do you think that a lot of, I mean, because you will hear people who take supplements like, oh my gosh, like I feel so much better after taking this, or I notice this is helping me lose body fat. Do you think that's generally speaking placebo?
Because a lot of times when people start taking a supplement, it's because they've noticed something in themselves. We're like, I don't feel that great. I might need some iron. I don't feel that great. Maybe I need some XYZ. So not only are they paying attention to how they feel, but then they start cleaning up their diet as well. Right. And so when you start cleaning up your diet and supplementing, you're going to feel better. It doesn't necessarily mean that the supplement is the X factor, it's the combination of things.
That's so true. Anything else you think would be important to mention within the context of what we're talking about regarding women's health and tips for them to optimize things like, burning body fat, building muscle, and living longer?
Yeah. One of the things that I was actually having a conversation with a couple of colleagues this morning looking at DEXAs. So people will go get a DEXA scan, right? And they'll go, oh, I have really good body composition. I have really good bone density. But what I want women who are 35 plus is not to pay attention so much about body composition, percent body fat, is visceral fat or visceral fat, depending on where you come from. Because there's been some recent medical cohorts where we have seen women who've come in with a long history of endurance. And so, from a general practitioner point of view, they're generally healthy. They look healthy, they exercise on a regular basis. But then we get their DEXA results and their blood results. And we see that, yeah, they might be 20% body fat, but their visceral fat is above 100 cubic centimeters, which means that they have an elevated risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And we get their blood results, and their LDL is elevated, their total cholesterol is elevated, and their A1C is elevated. So it's not protective when we're looking at the endurance exercise. So if you are a generally active woman who spends a lot of time doing endurance and you're 35 plus, if you get a DEXA, find out that visceral fat, find out your blood work, because it's better to take action now than when you're 45 or 50 and you're faced with lots of blood lipid issues and insulin resistant issues and high visceral fat.
Right. So do the same tips apply regarding like losing visceral fat, like strength training, cleaning up your diet, improving your overall health and wellness, like lifestyle and stuff like that?
Yeah, so we see the strongest impetus for losing visceral fat is resistance training and sprint training, because what that does is it creates a conversation from myokines to the liver. And then the liver is like, hey, these free fatty acids now need to go into the muscle. I don't have to esterify them and store them as visceral fat. So if you're looking for the biggest bang for your buck, it's you go in, you do some heavy lifting, finish with some sprint intervals, and get out. It works for men too, but it's really important for women.
Talk about the roles that both estrogen and testosterone play in women and why they should pay attention to that.
Yeah, so estrogen is really women's testosterone because estrogen in isolation is anabolic, just like the way that testosterone works in men. But women have to have a baseline of testosterone in order to kind of help some of the muscle tissue and recovery accumulate. So when we're looking at testosterone levels, which often get ignored in women, it has a baseline level to help with attenuating fatigue, to help with recovery, to help with muscle development, but it doesn't have the same role in women as it does for men. Estrogen does. So when we look at estrogen, estrogen is really tightly tied to like satellite cell development of the muscle tissue. It's responsible for how strong myosin bonds to actin for muscle contraction. And it also is responsible for how much acetylcholine is available for a nerve impulse to pass over to the muscle for muscle contraction and the speed of that contraction. So when we're looking at estrogen, it's really important that women maintain a circulation of estrogen that is appropriate for menstrual cycle health as well as all these other functions that it entails.
Diving more into estrogen, you hear a lot now when let's just talk about women. You hear this from men, but we're talking about women now. So let's stick with that. That when something is going on in their health, whether they can't lose weight, whether they're not sleeping, whether they're stressed, whatever it is, they'll say it's my hormones. My hormones are off. and you'll see them potentially go and try to get something like hormone replacement therapy. You'll see them just go to a clinic and try to like see if they can get that optimized. And I see that happening now, just younger and younger, right? Talk about the signs of somebody who truly has like low levels of estrogen, and then like how can they healthily um, like learn to optimize those without necessarily getting on hormones.
Yeah, so women don't age in the same fashion that men do. So if we're talking about women who are premenopausal, have a natural menstrual cycle, so in their late teens to mid 30s, if you start seeing changes in the bleed pattern, you start seeing changes in menstrual cycle length and start skipping menstrual cycle more and more, this is more of a sign that you're anovulatory and you're not producing enough progesterone, and you also have low levels of estrogen. We see this so often in recreational all the way through elite athletes because they are not optimizing their fueling. So we look at it's called a low energy availability. So they might do a trend of fasting or doing fasted training, or they might inadvertently delay eating after exercise. And so their body stays in this breakdown state, this catabolic state. And the brain perceives it as not enough nutrition. So it signals the body to start conserving. So one of the first things that goes is a luteinizing hormone pulse and an estrogen pulse. So when we first start seeing all these perturbations in bleed patterns and menstrual cycle length, it's a really good telling sign to pull back or kind of re-look at how you are fueling and what kind of training you're doing. As we start to get into our late 30s, early 40s, and we start seeing missteps in how we're responding to training, where we're having poor sleep or putting on body fat, we're tired but wired, this is more of a sign of perimenopause. And this is a natural function of getting older. You'll have more estrogen dominance, or you might have really low estrogen. It's really hard to pinpoint. But this is something that if you are having severe symptomology and you're really anxious, lots of mood disorder, really super, super tired, you might have vasomotor symptoms, then this is something to talk to your physician about, because it could be that you're low in testosterone and we need to boost the testosterone so that we can convert some of that testosterone back into estrogen. Or it might be that you have more and more anovulatory cycles as a symptom of perimenopause, and we need to perhaps think about menopause hormone therapy, or we have to start thinking more about what kind of training we're doing from an intensity perspective to get that boost of growth hormone and testosterone post exercise. So there's lots of little things to think about. So when we're younger, it's more about dropping volume and really paying attention to fueling in and around training. When we get into our late 30s, early 40s, it's more of a physiological function of our ovarian hormones, and then we can optimize like boosting testosterone and estrogen by changing the intensity and dropping the volume. Increase intensity, drop volume.
So talking about like perimenopause, I've had friends that have reached that stage, and they've mentioned that they can have these emotional swings, and they can just feel like they struggle mentally. So is the main way to decipher between a symptom of perimenopause and like a mental health issue to go get testing and get their hormones checked?
It's really hard because if you go get your bloods done, it's just a one point in time check of hormones. We need to see the trend. Because you might go get your bloods tested and your estrogen is really low, your testosterone is really low, and your follicular stimulating hormone is low. And then you go back a few weeks later and they're all elevated. Physicians really go on symptomology. So if there's a lot of mood disorder, one of the first things I tell women to start doing is taking creatine. So 3 to 5 grams of creatine is really super effective in helping stabilize mood, more so than women who have low grade of depression and take an SSRI. So creatine is one of the first steps there. And if it interferes with sleep and the depressive and anxious symptoms are from poor sleep, then we look at sleep hygiene and perhaps using L-theanine to help induce more of that parasympathetic response.
And we're going to come back to peri and postmenopause and what people can do to optimize that time in their life from a health, nutrition, and fitness standpoint. But I want to go back and spend some more time on premenopause. And let's just say that somebody who's 25, 30, 35 years old is listening to this and they're trying to do everything that they possibly can to optimize their health during this time. Um, I want to talk about that, but first, like I think as a precursor, if you could just outline what a healthy menstrual cycle looks like, so that way, if people are maybe they're not informed or they'd like to know more, so that they can understand if something's off, they'll be able to do so.
Yeah, sure. So a normal menstrual cycle, we talk about from one day of bleeding all the way through the month to the next day of bleeding. And a cycle is anywhere from 25 to 40 days. So when we talk about 28 days, that's just textbook, but most women don't have 28-day. We have the follicular phase, which is the low hormone phase. And in a normal cycle, it's anywhere from 14 to 20 days. And ovulation happens at the end of that. After ovulation, we have what we call the luteal phase or the high hormone phase with estrogen and progesterone coming up. And that usually is about 12 to 14 days. The follicular phase, the low hormone phase, is the one that shortens and lengthens, which is why people have either 25 to 40-day cycles. We talk about the bleed phase. That's around 5 to 7 days, and every woman's bleed pattern is a little bit different. The caveat is if a woman is having significantly, debilitating cramps and bleeding, that's heavy menstrual bleeding, and that's not normal. So we can look at that as a separate issue and you can get some medical help for that. But for the most part, we're like low hormone phase, ovulation, high hormone phase, and then it repeats.
And then, so if something seems to be off with the menstrual cycle, that's a time to potentially go and get your estrogen levels checked or consult with your physician to see what's going on there to make sure that there's not anything serious going on and seeing if you can kind of recalibrate all that, right?
Yeah, and I often recommend women just to get their bloods done every 3 to 4 months, just to be able to see a trend. I think in the US, they might let you do it every 6 months. And this is so that you have a history and you can see the fluctuation. And ideally, knowing what phase of the menstrual cycle you are when you go in to get your blood tests done. If you're really curious about estrogen levels, you want to get it done on day 2 of your cycle. If you're really curious about progesterone levels, then we look at day 21 or 22 of your cycle.
So I want to take it a bit broad for a second and then get specifically how people can adjust their diet and exercise around their cycle. But traditionally speaking, um, there's so much information out there. There's so many different workout modalities. There's boot camp classes, there's CrossFit, there's resistance training, there's cardio, there's this, there's that. What do you believe are the biggest levers that this young that what are the biggest levers that a female between the ages of say 25 to 35 can pull as far as what they include in their exercise regimen?
I'm the big rock across the board for women is strength training. And when you are in your reproductive years, it doesn't really matter if you're looking at hypertrophy type or power type training or pure strength type training. The goal is to build and maintain lean mass. And then you can complement it with whatever kind of cardiovascular stuff you want to do. If you're training specific for endurance, then you look at including endurance stuff. If you're looking for general health and trying to maintain high-end fitness and lower body fat, then you look at doing some high-intensity sprint interval training type stuff. But as you start to get older, especially when you hit that perimenopause stuff, this is where the big rock of power-based resistance training and specifically high-intensity sprint interval training comes into play. When we're looking at the younger set, our 25-year-old avatar here, we can look at periodizing or doing some undulation type work within the menstrual cycle, where we're looking at how the immune system behaves, how the body responds to stress. So we can look at doing heavier, higher load type work in the low hormone phase through ovulation. Then after ovulation, we start to have a change in stress resilience and the immune system, where we have more pro-inflammatory responses. So it's a little bit harder to adapt. So we want to try to look at what kinds of things can we do that kind of dampen inflammation. So this would be more steady state type work. and maybe looking at doing more power-based training instead of the hypertrophy type training. Because then we're looking at how we're working with the way that our hormones affect our central nervous system, our parasympathetic responses, as well as the immune system changes. Because if we're trying to do a heavy high load when our body's already prone to inflammatory responses, we're not going to get adaptation because that inflammation is going to dampen our adaptation.
Before we get into the specifics on what you mean by like shifting more into a power type training, people are incredibly busy now. They have so much going on, and I think it can be hard sometimes to track all this stuff. Have you found any tools to be useful for somebody to track their cycle so they can understand how to curate their um, exercise program around that?
We will get you back to this episode of the Adversity Advantage in just 1 second, but first, I want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Timeline Nutrition. Some of my main priorities right now are optimizing my health, wellness, and longevity. And as many of you know, I've been a fan of Timeline Nutrition and MitoPure for a really long time, especially these new longevity gummies. And right now, Timeline has a special offer that you can get 20% off your first Timeline purchase. And there's never been a better time to experience the benefits of MitoPure. And if you use my code Doug at checkout, you will receive 20% off today. If you've been thinking about trying Timeline, this is your sign. Once again, they're offering my audience a 20% discount on all first-time purchases. So use code Doug at checkout to get 20% off, or go to timeline.com/Doug to get 20% off. Again, timeline.com/Doug to get 20% off your first purchase of MitoPure and Timeline Nutrition. Now back to the show.
Yeah, and it depends on the person. Like if you're a person who's pen and paper type person, then you're just going to mark on your calendar like the first day your bleed starts, and maybe make some annotations throughout the month of how you feel, how you slept. If you're more digital oriented, then there are a couple of apps you can use. You can use Wild AI that uses female environment artificial intelligence to learn your cycle and feed back to you specifics. So like if always you're marking down on day 23 of your cycle that you feel flat, then it's going to come up and say, hey, tomorrow's day 23. You might want to reevaluate what kind of training you're doing. More 2D approach would be using something like Fitter Woman or Hello Clothes. So some of these digital platforms that are more just tracking like where you are in your cycle, but not necessarily feeding back information. But it really has to be what works for the individual.
And then moving on to like this, I get as specific as you can get, like protocol for how this young female avatar, let's say this 30-year-old female avatar could, work out. You said power based programming. Does that mean like you're focusing on 3 to 5 reps? Is it 2 to 4 reps? Like what does the programming look like, and what types of exercises should they be doing?
Yeah, when we talk about power based, we're looking more at compound movement. So your deadlifts, your squats, your Romanian deadlifts, push press, those kinds of things. Not fully Olympic lifts, but really looking at compound movements and doing a 3 to 5 set rule, right? So your 3 to 5 exercises, 3 to 5 sets, around 3 minutes recovery between. So it's really accessing the central nervous system. It's not fuel depleting, because we want to work on that neuromuscular recruitment. We want to work on the speed of contraction, and we don't want to be fuel depleting because that becomes more inflammatory. And this becomes a bit scary for a lot of women who are going into the gym because they don't really feel comfortable and they're not that familiar with lifting heavy loads. So if we're looking at power-based training and it's 80% or more of 1 rep max, a lot of women shy away from that, but they shouldn't. Like we want people to phase into it. We want people to move well and become confident in that, and then slowly start to put on load as they become more confident and move well.
And so do you recommend women who are, like you said, maybe a bit nervous to get started with this, they're a bit overwhelmed, they maybe don't like going into the gym? Do you recommend them working with a coach, or do you recommend them like watching some videos online to get themselves like acclimated to this process? Like how do you kind of casually get them started?
I'm really fond of the idea of working with a kinesiotherapist or a physical therapist that knows movement standards. Because if you have one or two sessions with them, they can identify faults in your movement and then give you recommendations of how to correct that fault. And then if you're really uncomfortable going into the gym, then there's some good platforms where you can learn how to do a deadlift properly. You can learn how to squat properly, but never underestimate getting a really good PT to take you through a program, teach you and watch you. And you don't have to invest a lot of time or money into it, but you definitely want some outside help so that you don't start doing movements with poor technique, because then that loads you up for injury.
So 3 to 5 exercises, 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 5 minute rest in between sets, correct? Um, what's the frequency like? Do you recommend 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week? What's your recommendation on that?
For a 30-year-old, minimum 2 days a week.
And then, so how do we, let's just say there's that person that is, I don't want to pick on specific companies, but they're going to certain classes 4, 5, 6 days a week. And it's just like crazy intensity, right? And they're just doing that for an hour, hour and a half, 45 minutes, whatever it is, every single day. And they're burning calories, right? They're burning more calories, maybe throughout that session than they may during a session like we're describing. What's the elevator pitch to convince this person to be okay with dialing it back and convincing them that less is more?
That is talking to everyone who's like in their 30s to 50s, right? Because the mentality of calorie in, calorie out, got to burn, be high intense. It's really asking, like, what is their goal? Why are you going to these classes every day? Is it for the social aspect, or are you looking for body comp change and to get fitter? Because if you're looking for body comp change and to get fitter, then you're wasting your time and your money. Because if you're always putting yourself into this moderate intensity, then you're elevating baseline cortisol. You're not getting the same kind of growth hormone and testosterone response that we find after intense exercise or intense lifting. So it's kind of like you're paying money to hit a brick wall. If we are concerned about body comp and weight gain, then it's about, okay, we want to reduce the intensity because we want to reduce the cortisol. If we're reducing the cortisol, we also want to bump up the protein. Because if we're reducing cortisol, we're also reducing systemic inflammation, which then feeds forward to less bloating and puffiness. We also see the body starts to kind of release body fat, so to speak. And the protein part is so important, especially if we're doing a lot of breakdown type activities. I try to get people to drop at least one class a week if they're doing 4 or 5 classes or more in a week, and be like, okay, let's take one, have more recovery day, but I don't mean sit on your butt all day. Let's go and look at functional movement. Let's look at active recovery, and let's see how you sleep. Because if you're always hitting yourself and you're going so hard every day, it does interfere with sleep because you can't get into a parasympathetic drive. That's how you get really good sleep architecture. So it's kind of a biohacking of, let's pull you back just one day. Let's pull you back one day and see how it goes. And then maybe let's pull you back 2 days and substitute those high intense classes with something less intense, but still beneficial to the body.
So what I'm hearing you say is for people to dial back these workout classes and look more into functional movements and doing compound movements, whether it be push press, bent over row, pull up, squat, deadlift, various types of lunges, et cetera, and then like building off of that and see how their body composition changes.
Yeah.
You mentioned cortisol, and we've talked extensively on the podcast how chronic stress obviously isn't good for you. But as cortisol relates to weight gain, you've heard a lot that, oh my gosh, I'm just stressed and that's why I'm gaining weight. Like, why does that happen?
Yeah. Some cortisol is good. It allows us to function well. But too much is not good, because if we have too much circulating cortisol, it becomes our new baseline. And cortisol is primarily a flight or fight response hormone. It's a sympathetic driver. And if we have a high amount of baseline cortisol, we're always in a sympathetic drive. So that means our body can never relax. if it can't relax and it's always in that prime state to actually accelerate and fight and move away from the beast, which means there has to be extra fuel to do that. And if we are in that higher baseline sympathetic drive, the fuel for women ends up being fat. Because as I was talking to you off the recording, women go through blood sugar and then tap into free fatty acids. So the automatic response for a female body under high stress is to store body fat. So if we're looking at, how am I going to lose weight and how am I going to sleep better, it is about how are we mitigating this elevated cortisol. We have to have times where we are looking at instigating the parasympathetic drive and not staying tired but wired.
Do you think it's more common for the same female avatar, given the people that you've worked with, that the reason that they can't lose the excess body fat they want, is it because of elevated cortisol levels, or is it because they're eating too many calories?
For the most part, it's elevated cortisol and not eating enough. Because so many women, especially in the 30-40 age bracket, fall into these trendy diets of fasting or keto or whatever is popular. And again, most of that data comes from either clinical participants, clinical data, so obese, sedentary women, or male data who are in an athletic population, but it doesn't transfer over to women. Women do better in a fed state. We know this through really robust research. And if a woman is not following up her program, her workout with any kind of protein or carbohydrate, then her body stays in this breakdown state, this sympathetic drive, this breakdown state, which then signals the hypothalamus that, hey, there's no nutrition coming in. We have to start downturning thyroid. We have to start downturning all of these other hormone, pulses so that we can conserve energy. So when I am talking to someone who is like this avatar and is hammering it hard, usually gets up, gets to the gym first thing, then, showers at the gym, goes to work, has a long day at work, comes home, might meet people after work, and is just continuously on the go and isn't fueling properly for exercise stress or daily stress. We pick up a plan and be like, okay, we're going to make sure that you have protein before and after regularly throughout the day. Not only do they find they have more energy, but the weight starts to shift and they start sleeping better. It takes about 3 weeks. And then all of a sudden they're like, whoa, what's just happened? And it's complementing what the body needs and what the brain is perceiving at the same time as dialing back that cortisol.
What are a few of the common myths or misconceptions out there that are actually doing more harm than good when it comes to women's health?
I think there's a few undercurrents here. One, that the calories in, calories out conversation keeps being had, and that women age in a linear fashion. So what they do in their 20s can keep carrying them through. And then I think the other one is a lot of the diet culture that's out there, especially when we talk about cardio and trying to do moderate intensity training and different types of things that are being promoted to women who are 40 plus that can cause more catabolism or breakdown of lean mass and bone than actually building it.
Why do you think that people tend to believe these things despite people like yourself and others coming out and talking about what the actual science and research says?
Long history of how women have been treated in media and media portrayal, all the images now on social media and people promoting something that's not necessarily what they're doing. And it's that rhetoric of, this is what someone does, so this is what I need to do to look like them or be like them, when we know that you can have a case study of one and put that out there instead of looking at the general recommendations and going, is this applicable to me? Or is it applicable to someone who's in a different population? And if it's not applicable to me, then what is? So there's a lot of confusion out there because we have the skewing of, influencers. We have a skewing of how women are supposed to be. We have the sociocultural constructs of lifting, like people are look at lifting in a different fashion versus 20 and the 40s. Yeah, it's interesting to see how we have such a cultural divide on how that influences how women are perceiving their health and what they should be doing.
And you talked about influencers and like social media. And I think that's important to talk about because I do think that the way you look is important, right? Like I think people's goals one of the biggest drivers for people when they work out is ultimately how do they look when they look at themselves in the mirror, right? And I think sometimes that in the name of health and longevity and like not being vain, I think sometimes that gets lost when I think there is a certain level of importance there and that people should talk about that. How can, since we're talking about women here, how can women blend the two? How can they prioritize and take care of their health in a way that they can still appreciate the way that they look when they look in the mirror while also making sure it's not, in a way, sacrificing their overall health?
Yeah, I always tell people to look forward 5, 10, 15 years. Like, where do you want to be in 5 years with regards to how you're moving, how you're living? Are you independent? And then let's put another 10 years onto that. If you're 40, what do you want to be doing when you're 50? How do you want to be moving? Do you want injury? You do want to have, better health? Are you independent? And then when we're in our 50s, it's like, okay, well, how do you want to age? Do you want to be 80 living independently without any bone issues and feeling really good and being able to do what you want to do? Or do you want to be in assisted care? So it's kind of I try to marry the health and performance sides together, because if you in 5 years want to be moving really well, we have to look and see what you're doing now. If you're doing nothing but cardiovascular work and you're not taking care of muscle mobility, you're not looking at soft tissue, you're not looking at bone density, then in 5 years, you're pretty much guaranteed, if you're in your 40s, that you're looking at soft tissue injury, maybe a decrease in bone density, and it doesn't matter what you look like. In 10 years, it's pretty much guaranteed that if you just stay this route and you're not putting in strength training, you're not looking at mobility, you're not looking at soft tissue quality, then you're going to be facing this whole issue of low muscle quality, poor mobility, poor bone density. And that's going to directly affect what you look like as well. So we take it step by step.
So do you think that, based on what you said, that building muscle is the biggest needle mover for women when it comes to overall health and longevity?
Yeah, across the board. Doesn't matter what age. It depends on how you periodize it or scope what you're doing with regards to resistance training. But we're seeing new and really compelling data come out now that women are being put in the weight room, and we're looking at research on women in resistance training. We're seeing not only does it improve our musculoskeletal aspect with regards to muscle quality and bone density, we're also looking at neuroplasticity. We're looking at improvement of bone density, our agility, our balance, our proprioception, all of those things that make you a very capable, independent human can be linked to how we're doing resistance training. And then when we look at the cardiovascular work, that is another separate case. We're looking at what are we doing with regards to endurance? What are we doing with regards to high intensity? What are our goals? Because we see cardiovascular outcomes are also getting benefit from doing resistance training.
I'd love to dive into like some effective ways for people to lift weights, because there's so many different ways now that people are looking at on the internet or like in real life. There's exercise classes, there's things like Peloton that include some weights in their programs now. There's different things to do at the gym. There's machines, there's free weights, there's lifting heavy, there's, lifting to get toned, like all these things we've heard. What does the science actually say regarding the most effective way for women to train to build muscle?
So I'll put off the bat, it's really, really difficult for women to get bulky. And I think that's one of the stepping fears for doing anything outside of light weights. Because when we're looking at how women build muscle, it's a combination of estrogen and central nervous system. And estrogen is a driver for lean mass development, as well as how strong a muscle contraction is and how fast it actually contracts. It's not like testosterone, where you have an impetus for massive anabolic responses to build and become really bulky. So, when we're looking at resistance training, I always tell women any kind of load is great. So, if you're going to go from doing nothing to body weight, that's a step in the right direction. If you're going from body weight to some lighter dumbbell work, yeah, that's a step in the right direction. But we're always looking to challenge. So if you're in your 20s and 30s, you can get away with trying a lot of different things. But when you start getting into your late 30s, early 40s onwards, we have to be a bit more specific, where we're not looking at working to failure because that's more of a metabolic stress. We're looking at lifting heavier loads to work on power and strength because we lose that rapidly when we start having a flux in our hormones. So when I'm working with women and trying to get them to understand that there's a whole bunch of different things we can do if we want to look at working on power and agility, we need to do things like contrast training. We need to do some plyo work, maybe a pyramid scheme and periodize that way. But when we get into our late 30s, early 40s, we have to really look at power based training. And it's scary for women because they're like, wait, I've not been in the weight room. I don't know how to do compound movements. What if I've never done anything before? How do I work my way into that? It's like we phase you in, right? We look at how you move. We do a lot of mobility, make sure you're not going to get injured. And then we start adding load. We're looking at how are we improving our overall physique, yes, but also that physiological response for longevity.
Some people will say, just in the training phases, right, of training, the body differently, that it can be better to train for hypertrophy initially to build some foundational muscle before doing things like lifting heavy weights and doing more like strength focus. Do you think that, somebody who hasn't been doing a lot of resistance training should start on something like machines, some light dumbbells and stuff to build some muscle before doing things like these compound movements and explosive movements like you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not about building the hypertrophy like muscle tissue itself, it's that neural pathway that we want. And when you first start lifting, be it machines or dumbbells or free weights, you get that neural pathway. And that's what we're after. We're after those motor patterns. Once you have really good motor patterns and some strength, then you can start making it more compound and more complex. Yeah, I mean, something like Planet Fitness, it's amazing because it's opened the doors to resistance training to so many people who never otherwise would have stepped into a gym. But for people who are beyond the machines, it's like, nah, I don't want to go there. I want to find something that's different. So there is that open door for so many people when we're looking at, can I use machines? Can I use dumbbells? Yeah, absolutely. But we want to really look at how we move and we go sit to stand. What's a great move for sit to stand? It's not using a machine. It's like doing a barbell back squat, or we're doing a front squat, something to that effect.
And so what would you say are like once somebody builds like baseline level of neural adaptation like you're talking about, what are the top exercises you think people should focus on?
Yeah, I think it varies. I always like to look at it as if you have 3 days a week in the gym, we do a squat focus on one day, we do a push pull overhead motion another day, and then the third day we're doing all posterior chain work. And you can vary the exercises within those, but it's all in planar movement. And are we doing some plyo work in a squat focus? Are we doing some uniplanar work when we're doing our posterior chain? So there's, like I said, there's lots of different exercises that you can do, but we look at it as those are the three, I guess, ideal areas and motions that you want to work on.
If somebody's going to the gym 3 days a week, like what should their time in the gym look like? Let's just say somebody only has like 45 minutes to an hour. Like how should they break that down when they get in there?
Well, how old are we?
Let's just say somebody who's like 35 to 45.
Okay, so if we have a 35 to 45-year-old woman who's going into the gym and say it's a squat focus day, you go in and you do maybe a 2 minute warm up of sorts to get your heart rate up. And then you get into some mobility exercises. And so, all up, that might be maybe 10 minutes worth of work. And then we go into something like a 5x5 or a pyramid scheme where you're going 10, 8, 4, 4, 2, and getting progressively heavier. And that might be on the 3 or 4 minute. And then we finish off with maybe some dumbbell split squats and then some mobility, and then you're out of there. So all up, you're in there maybe 40, 45 minutes. It doesn't have to take a long time. Like I hear people, I don't have an hour and a half to go to the gym. I'm not asking you to go for an hour and a half. And in that session, if you're like, wait, I don't even have 45 minutes, do some mobility, do your squats, and then get out of there. And then you're in and out in maybe 25 to 30 minutes.
You've been mentioning the word mobility several times in the first few minutes of our conversation. That often falls by the wayside when people go to the gym, especially if they're busy and they don't have a lot of time. Why do you think that people should prioritize mobility when they're going to the gym?
When we look at mobility and being able to lift properly, you want full range of motion. We're not talking about stretching. We're trying to get into the joint and the joint capsules themselves to be able to get triple extension so that your ankles, your knees, your hips all working together to get into the depth of a squat without compromising how you're moving. And people will go and they won't warm up properly. They don't do mobility and their form is off. And that's how we get injured. So if you spend 5 minutes really making sure that you can get into all those corners of those joints and be able to move properly in that pattern that you're going into work, then you are definitely reducing injury. You're also improving the technique that you're working, and you start to see better gains and feel better.
What would you say are maybe 3 or 4 of your favorite mobility exercises that are pretty simple for people to do, that if they want to start to implement these at the gym, they can do so before going into a lifting session?
Yeah, banded hamstring stretch. So it's a thicker band that's wrapped around the rig and it distracts your hip as you step forward to do a hamstring stretch. You do banded pigeon. Also taking a kettlebell and sitting into a deep goblet squat and getting into each corner. So you're moving in each corner. Those tend to open up the hips and the lower back and the hamstrings to get into really good posterior and squat movements.
When I asked you what people's workout routine should look like in the gym, you asked me what age are we talking about. Why did you ask me that? And how should people's workout programs change as they get older?
Yeah, so if we're looking at women who are 35 and younger, well, I should preface that like after you go through puberty, so you're 20 to 35, your body's really resilient and very adaptable. So you can play around with sets, reps, periodization, types of training that you're doing. If you have 40 minutes in the gym, maybe you are doing supersets and compound movements and then finishing with some sprint work. But if you're younger than 20 and going in through puberty, we have to look at functional movement because motor patterns and everything need to be redeveloped with the biomechanical changes that occur in puberty. And then when we get into peri and postmenopause, we have to be very specific because of the ratio of estrogen and progesterone changing. We need to find an external stress that's going to create adaptive responses in the body the way those hormones used to support. So this is why we look at the power-based stuff because that becomes a central nervous system drive rather than a peripheral or localized drive.
Right. And you talked also about the fear of women getting bulky. And I don't remember if we covered this the last time or not, but I think that, you know, has been debunked pretty clearly over the last, I don't know, 10 years probably. But I think the question still exists, and I just have seen people still talk about like, oh, I don't want to lift weights because I don't want to get bulky, or I don't want to do strength training, I don't want to deadlift, I don't want to do a bent over row, etc. Because I'm afraid that if I lift heavy, I'm gonna look like Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. You know what I mean? So, um, from a hormone perspective, talk about why that's impossible.
So if we look at the anabolic responses of testosterone in men, it's not just testosterone. It's the combination of growth hormone and other feedback factors that make testosterone really stimulate muscle development. When we look at women, yes, we have testosterone, but it doesn't work in the same way that it does in men in the fact that it doesn't stimulate muscle and muscle growth. Estrogen does. So when we look at estrogen, it's not as a potent anabolic agent as testosterone. So when we're looking at estrogen in women, we see that there are estrogen receptors that are in the muscle cell and skeletal muscle itself that is responsible for stimulating basal development, also metabolism, how much carbohydrate can come in to fuel the muscle. We also see that women have more slow twitch fibers than men. So this means that they're more endurant. So they don't have those fast twitch glycolytic bulky type fibers. And the stimulation of our nervous system to women's muscles. We see that they're a little bit slower in the nerve conduction. as compared to men because of the more oxidative fibers. So we look at all the combination of estrogen and the morphology of the muscle. It's really, really difficult for women to get bulky. Now, the caveat there is that a woman who's never had muscle mass before will start lifting, and in her eyes, she might be getting bulky, but to everyone else, you can't really see anything except for a little bit of muscle definition. So that's where we have to really caveat and say, look, you're not getting bulky, you're getting stronger, and we see muscle tone, but that is not equating to bulk.
What do you tell somebody when they come to you and they are starting to gain muscle and they feel that they're getting bulky? Like, how do you help them overcome that fear and then also kind of talk them off the ledge about the benefits of being strong as a woman?
Yeah, I always bring it back to strength and how they're feeling. Like you came into the gym 3 months ago and you couldn't even bench press two 20-pound dumbbells. Now you're up to two 45-pound dumbbells and you're super strong. Your posture is better. You're having more energy. Yes, you do have some more muscle, but that doesn't mean that, you're blowing out of your clothes. If someone is really concerned because they're more mesomorphic and they can put muscle definition on easily, and they're saying, well, my clothes aren't fitting more, then we can modify the kind of training that they're doing to become more metabolic. So this is more of our upper reps, more endurance type work. And that's what women are used to. And this starts to change instead of more power based, which makes people feel like they're going to blow out of their shirts, into more of that Pilates type stuff that we don't necessarily really want to promote when we're looking at older women, but it does help with the mental effect of feeling like they're going to blow out of their shirts.
Right. And, one of the reasons that somebody may feel or look bulky is because they might frankly be eating too many calories. So, moving into talking about nutrition, when somebody's looking to build muscle, like what's a good framework to follow from a nutrition perspective to make sure that they're not going to gain as much body fat when doing so?
This is a complex question. So I bring it back to circadian rhythm and chronobiology. So we talk about circadian rhythms, and everyone thinks about it as a 24-hour clock, but it's not. For women, our circadian pulse is a little bit shorter than men's. And in that, we have hormone pulses. And where I'm going with this is that when we look at circadian malalignment or a misstep in our circadian rhythm, we see that women end up having a change in their appetite hormones. So they end up having more cravings, they end up having a precedence for wanting more carbohydrate, and they don't feel full. So when we talk about what changes our circadian rhythm, it's delaying food and not looking at daylight and then eating late. So when I bring it to women saying, look, we want to build muscle and reduce body fat, but specifically really reduce visceral fat. And we want to eat according to our circadian rhythm. So that means for women, because we have a higher cortisol peak within a half an hour of waking up as compared to men, we need to have a little bit of protein and carbohydrate to dampen that peak and to tell the hypothalamus that we have some nutrition ready to go and we're good to go for the day. And we want to eat protein at every meal, hitting about 40 grams. And we want to make sure that we are fueling for our training and recovering from our training. And then we have dinner, but we don't have anything after dinner. So it might be using buzzwords of a 7 to 7 overnight fast, which is a 12-hour fast, but really we're working with our circadian rhythm. When we look at the research that shows by working with our circadian rhythm or eating according to how our body needs fuel, we have less circadian malalignment, so we have less interruption in our appetite hormones. We have less precedence for blood sugar irregularities. We have less of a stimulus for putting on body fat. And then when women are like, wait, I need to lose some weight too, it's like, okay, well, if we want to lose a little bit more body fat, then we take maybe 150 calories away from the night meal. And this is a small enough calorie deficit, and it's going to allow your body to digest better so that overnight it can get into all its reparation it needs to do. So there isn't a magic bullet to it. It's more about timing. And when we're talking about the quality of food, like I said, I'm not a huge calorie in, calories out person because 4 calories of carbs react differently in the body than 4 calories of protein. So we have to be very mindful of the timing and the nutrition density of the food that we're eating.
It's interesting coming from like a science background that you're not as, excited or I guess dogmatic about the calories in, calories out approach. Talk more in depth about why and some things for people to keep in mind as they're eating food throughout the day.
Yeah. So calories and the nutrition label of calories all stemmed from a research point of view of trying to really determine the energy that was associated with food. And it's a rough calculation. So when we start looking at the non mathematical aspect of food and energy of food, it reacts differently in the body. So, like I said, 4 calories of carbohydrate have a different response than 4 calories of protein. Those 4 calories of carbohydrate coming from a carrot is completely different from 4 calories of carbohydrate coming from carrot juice. And people are like, why? It's because the carrot has fiber, carrot juice does not. The fiber really helps to avoid any kind of blood sugar flux that happens when you get fruit sugars. And yes, carrots have a higher amount of fructose in it. And the fiber also helps with the gut microbiome. The juice doesn't. So when we start getting into the nuances of calories in, calories out, that 4 grams or 4 calories from carbohydrate from the carrot, is it juice or is it the whole carrot? Completely different responses in the body. So when we start looking at how we should be eating, I really want people to understand that we want to take care of our gut microbiome first. So more fibery foods, more colorful fruit and veg, and really good protein. Trying to not reach for, I was in the States recently and saw protein fortified Pop Tarts. I was like, that completely misses the mark. That's not what we want to get from our protein, right?
Sounds delicious though.
Every once in a while, if it's in the 20% rule, but
Protein Pop Tarts, come on now.
I know. I just think ultra processed, ultra processed. Where is it coming from? But yeah, and as an expat, I find it really interesting the two different food systems. Well, like I've traveled to Europe, I live in New Zealand, I go back to the States on a regular basis. And I go to the States and I walk into a grocery store and there's rows and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of things that they say is food, but can't eat it. I can eat the fruit and veg. I can eat some of the other things, but there's so much packaging and sugar and additives and ultra processed stuff that it's no wonder people are confused.
So your rationale for focusing on quality, versus the quantity of the food really revolves around like how people will feel after eating them, well, and also from a performance perspective and from a like a longevity perspective and how they impact you from a physiological level, impact things like the gut microbiome, et cetera, right?
Yep, absolutely. And the timing's important too to avoid the hypothalamus going, hey, I'm in a low energy state. Because if we exercise on an empty stomach as a woman, or we delay food intake post exercise as a woman or a man, then the brain perceives you as being in a low energy state. And the automatic response is down regulating all the systems in the body. And that's counterproductive. So if I talk to a woman, she's like, oh, yeah, I went to the gym, I had coffee before, and then I wasn't hungry afterwards, and I was rushing around and I didn't have food until 11 or 12. I'm like, why'd you go to the gym? Because you stayed in a breakdown state the whole time. You didn't have any impetus for building muscle.
Explain like why some of these fad diets can be so dangerous for women.
Okay. So if we talk about fasting itself, if you're someone who gets up, has breakfast, does training, eats throughout the day, and then you stop eating you stop eating after dinner and you don't eat again until breakfast. So you have a 12 to 14 hour overnight fast. That can be called fasting or it can be called normal eating. That's fine. So when you start getting into the exaggerated fast where you don't eat until noon and then you have a small window in the afternoon where you're eating and then you have dinner, then you don't eat again until noon the next day. This is where it starts to get into a problem, both for men and women, but specifically for women. From a chronobiological standpoint, we're seeing in the research that those people who delay their calorie intake till noon have most of the calories in the afternoon, and then don't eat after dinner, and they maintain that cycle where they're eating noon to maybe 6 p.m. There's a higher incidence of obesity and a higher incidence of sarcopenia, both in men and women. When we look at active women who are doing a lot of their training fasted, we see there's a higher incidence of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, and the syndromes there, and a lot of endocrine dysfunction. And this has to do really with the hypothalamus. Because if we look at the hypothalamus, in men, there's one area in the hypothalamus that has kisspeptin neurons. In women, there are two areas that have kisspeptin neurons. Now, why kisspeptin is really important is that it is an appetite control center and an endocrine control center. So for women, the baseline, I guess, calorie intake before we start to see perturbance in our endocrine function is around 35 calories per kilogram fat-free mass. For men, it's 15. So if we're looking at that threshold right there, we see that when women start to do a lot of exercise stress or a lot of physical stress, be it, life stress when they're awake, this threshold really perturbs the kisspeptin neurons. And when the kisspeptin neurons are like, hey, there's not enough fuel coming in, then they start to downregulate. If we downregulate, then this is where we start to see that decrease in our luteinizing hormone pulse, decrease in estrogen pulse, a cessation of menstrual cycle function and thyroid function. We also see a misstep in our appetite and our appetite hormones because estrogen drives and controls appetite as well. For men, we don't have the same thing. So when we start looking at fasting and the data on fasting, the outcomes for men, that is more parasympathetic drive, we see better telomere responses, and we see better health outcomes. It's because the threshold for perturbance is not the same in men as it is for women.
Gotcha. And then, so I know you've spent a few minutes talking about like what necessarily not to do. Let's talk about like what they can, what females can do to optimize their nutrition. You mentioned that protein is like the biggest lever that they can pull from a macronutrient standpoint, making sure they're optimizing that. How much protein should they be aiming to get? How does that differ around like workout timing? And then what else should encompass their diet?
So if I were to do like the guidelines, right, where we look at perimenopausal women getting 1.4 to 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight a day. Peri and postmenopausal, it's around 1.8 to 2.2 grams. But what does that look like in real life, right? People are like, what does that mean? So if I were to say someone gets up and has a training session at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, if it is strength training, then we're looking at 10 to 15 grams of protein beforehand. And that can be a couple of tablespoons of cottage cheese. It could be a scoop of protein powder in your coffee. It's not a lot. If we are looking at some kind of cardiovascular work with some strength, then we want to add an extra 30 grams of carbohydrate to that 15 grams of protein. So that could be a banana or half a banana that you're adding to your protein fortified coffee. Again, not a lot, but it is enough to signal the hypothalamus that, yeah, there's some nutrition coming in. We also know that by having that protein before a strength training session, it increases the post-exercise oxygen consumption. So basically keeps your metabolism elevated for a little bit longer period of time than if you didn't have it. Post-exercise, super important, regardless of what you do, is women who are younger want to get between 25 and 30 grams of protein. So that's about palm size. And that can be in breakfast. Doesn't have to be something special. It can be breakfast with carbohydrate. So about 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram or half a gram per pound. And then throughout the day, we're looking at around 30 grams at each meal. So again, that's palm-sized portion of protein at every meal and about 10 to 15 grams per every snack. When we're looking at the peri to postmenopausal set, it's a little bit more than that. It's palm and a half size for every meal and about that 15 grams for every snack.
And then for the 30-year-old avatar outside of protein, I know that one of the other big trends now is like going low carb, keto, and low fat was also a craze back in the day as well. What are the guidelines around the other macronutrients in your opinion, based on the research that this avatar should really include in their diet?
Yeah, carbohydrate availability is another big one. So if someone is trying to be an athlete, knowing that we say a person is athlete if they exercise on purpose, low carbohydrate availability is one of the leading reasons for a lot of metabolic and cardiovascular perturbances that we see. So making sure there's adequate carbohydrate. What does that mean? That means that when you are in the high hormone phase, that you really want to make sure that you're eating some carbohydrate before and after each exercise session, because the elevation in estrogen progesterone really inhibits your body's ability to access carbohydrate. So again, it all comes down to how are we making fuel available for the exercise stress at hand? We're in the lower hormone phase. We're just having regular bits of carbohydrate throughout the day. So that is colorful fruit and veg. Don't be afraid of sourdough bread. Don't be afraid of grains. We need carbs. Women need carbs. And again, it brings it back to that threshold response that the hypothalamus has. When we start looking at keto, we start looking at the low carb, high fat. The baseline for that really is to become, quote, more metabolically efficient. But women are already there by the nature of sex differences that occur within the mitochondria that I've talked about. We already have that metabolic efficiency. We're already able to burn more free fatty acids. Estrogen boosts that as well. So when we're looking at the metabolic data that comes out through low carb, high fat, or ketogenic, again, it's based on male physiology, where men don't have the advantage of more protein for fatty acid use, and they don't have the expression of estrogen that changes the body's availability of carbohydrate. So women need more carbohydrate. We need to have adequate carbohydrate for blood glucose because that's what our body uses, and also with the eye to keeping the kisspeptin neurons happy.
And so, talking about healthy fats, what roles do healthy fats play in this the same avatar's health that we're talking about? And then what are the best types of healthy fats in your opinion for this specific person?
I'm glad we're not in the 80s and the snack well craze of, no fat, no fat. uh, Fat is good. Our body needs it. Don't be afraid of it. But we look at it from nuts and seeds and avocados. Even some animal fat is fine. It's just not going above that 35% of your total calories from fat. But yeah, don't be afraid of it. Include it in every meal. We know things like olive oil and salad makes the vitamins and minerals in the greens more available. So don't be light-handed in the healthy fats.
Talking about like an issue that I think is, I guess, like brings this all together is I would say that a lot of the people that I've come across in my career, and even just people that I know, like their main goal is they want to look a certain way. They want to be lean. They want to be strong. They want to look good and feel good in their clothes. Um, but I think sometimes based on what people might see on the internet, their idea of what health and being lean looks like is different from what the science actually says. So if you could talk about like what is a healthy body fat percentage for this female avatar, what does being lean truly mean? I think people would really appreciate that.
Yeah. So when we look at like the basic science and talk about percent body fat, women have 12 to 13% essential fat. So that's, in and around the organs, myelin sheath, that kind of stuff. But when we start really talking about percent body fat, um, it's really hard to dial it in. And the fact that what we want to know is health status. How are you feeling? What's your power to weight ratio? Are you improving in the gym? How are you sleeping? How is your resting heart rate? How's your heart rate variability? So all those training metrics are more important than percent body fat. Even though people are like, oh, I want to be as lean as possible, that might not be what genetically you're predisposed to doing or how happy your body is. If we're looking at images on the internet, most of those are photoshopped or through filters. We look at elite athletes. That's not the ideal. If we're talking about a bell curve, right? We have people who are either end of the bell curve, and elite athletes sit on the very far right side of the bell curve because they're always on the teetering point of being overtrained or sick because they have to maintain a certain performance standard. If we read a lot of Trent Stellingworth's work about his wife, who is a professional Olympic caliber runner, she perturbates in her body composition across the year. It's higher in body fat off season, starts the season higher body fat, and then it naturally starts to come down as she starts racing more to a peak race. And that's healthy. Trying to maintain an ideal of a body fat is not sustainable. So it's more about the health metrics and being comfortable in your body, but also making sure that where you sit allows you to sleep well, recover well, not get sick easily, be able to keep improving in your power, keep improving in your strength, keep improving in your speed. And your body will naturally fall into where its ideal body fat is.
What are some healthy metrics, targets that this female avatar can aim for, can set a goal towards when it comes to their strength? Meaning, should they be able to deadlift a certain amount of their weight? Should they be able to do X amount of pull-ups? Like, what are some healthy ways to measure that?
Yeah, it's hard really because what kind of training is she doing? What is her end goal, right? So like I have 8 factor and it took me 11 years to do one pull-up. No matter how much I wanted to do 10 or 11 pull-ups or more, just not that feasible because I have such long levers. But for deadlifts, it's super easy because I have long levers. So if our avatar is someone who has long levers, then the metrics and output that she's going to have is going to be different from someone who has a long torso. Again, so that's like body shape and genetics that come into play. The best way to look about it is if you're doing undulating periodization and looking at stepwise increments in strength, you want to have a test retest situation every about 12 weeks and see how you're progressing. And you might get to a point where you're like, oh my gosh, I can deadlift 100 kilos. So around the 220-pound mark. And that's massive for a woman. If she's training specifically for Olympic lifting, then it could be a different story. But if she's training for life, then you don't have to be so focused on what is one health parameter, but just make sure that functionally you can move and move well. And if someone whacks on extra weight, then yeah, it's going to be challenging, but you're not going to get injured.
That all makes sense. Like making sure that you're focusing on just progressive overload and making sure that you're getting better and that you're gradually feeling better, getting stronger, sleeping better, and that sort of thing. From a body composition standpoint, I know that depending on where it's located, excess body fat can cause some health problems long term. So I don't want to completely say that we should avoid paying attention to that. Where does it matter most for this female avatar as far as where they store body fat?
If there's a lot of abdominal adiposity or visceral abdominal fat, then that's where we have a worry because that's more, quote, active fat that becomes an issue with metabolic disease. Storing around the hips and thighs, not so much. And it mobilizes easier from the hips and thighs than it does the abdomen. If we are looking at our avatar having a lot of abdominal adiposity and going, I just can't get rid of it, then we can look at periodizing our nutrition as well, where we have times where there's a high intake of protein under heavy loads and lower carbohydrate, and then we periodize more carbohydrate back in to help kind of get rid of the visceral fat. But we have to be very specific on the kind of training that we're doing when we're trying to do that. So we want to look at plyometric work, we want to look at sprint interval training and heavy lifting, because that combination of those three actually targets to reduce visceral fat. So it's not something we do all the time. It's just a training block to start to reduce it. And then once you reduce it, we can do things to manipulate to keep it low.
Talk about the protocol for high intensity interval training and what that looks like, because I feel like that can sometimes be confused with some of these exercise classes that we're trying to scale back.
I have no problems calling out things like Orange Theory and F45. I'll say that right out loud.
Don't pick on my boy Mark Wahlberg.
Well, I will. It's okay for dudes. But when we're looking at those kinds of classes, it puts people squarely in moderate intensity. It's not true high intensity. If we look at what true high intensity training is, true high intensity training is an interval that's anywhere from 1 minute to 5 minutes at 85 to 110% of your max. the higher intensity, the lower the interval is going to last, right? So if we're looking at a true high intensity class, it might be 5 to 10 minutes of mobilization warm up. Then we're doing 4 sets of 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off. And that 4 minutes is at 85 to 90% of your max. And then a cool down, right? So we're not maintaining this 70 to 80% heart rate that most of these exercise classes have people doing, where they feel smashed, but it actually hasn't done anything except put them in a tired state. One thing that I really want people to understand is if you're doing sprint interval training, it's so much better from a cardiovascular and a metabolic standpoint, especially if you're trying to strip down body fat, than doing high intensity interval work. So, true sprint interval training, each interval is 30 seconds or less. And the fitter you go, the shorter the recovery is. So, it might start off with 30 seconds of full gas, 110 or more of what you can do. So, you feel like you're going to vomit for 30 seconds. And then you have 2 to 4 minutes complete recovery. And then you go again. And you might only be able to do 2 or 3 of those when you first start. But the idea of the recovery is so that you can hit that interval as hard as possible without a real fatigue delay. And as you get fitter, it might be you're doing 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off times 9. But the goal again is that 30 seconds on is as hard as you possibly can. And when we look at the research that's looking at what it does, we see better vascular control, so better blood pressure, better cardiovascular health. We see better blood glucose control, less stimulus for putting on and storing fat. And we have a subsequent increase in growth hormone and testosterone after these sprint interval sessions, which then feeds forward into not only better hormone control, but there's also a feed forward to better sympathetic drive and better sleep. So if we're really trying to maximize our health, we need to incorporate that sprint interval training much more so than we're looking at the high intensity, like 4 minute intervals.
And so as far as program design, I know like a theme of the conversation has been less is more. But just from a convenience standpoint, would you recommend like throwing in like some of the sprint training towards the end of a resistance training workout, or would you recommend doing it on a separate day? Would you recommend doing it like later in the day or before a workout, like or before a resistance workout? Like how do you recommend all that?
If you're time crunched, then I often look at someone who warms up with box jumps before their heavy resistance training and then finishes off with a couple of sprints on the bike or the treadmill, right? So you're getting kind of a plyo warm up, and then you're getting your heavy resistance training, which is the bulk of what you want to do, and then you finish up with some sprint stuff. If you have more luxury of time, then you'd separate them out. You would be like, one day I'm doing heavy lifting, the next day I'm really focusing on sprint interval training. But again, everyone's time poor, and time management is one of those things. So it's not detrimental if you do resistance and then finish off with some sprint work, as long as you don't do it every day.
So shifting gears, I think we've talked extensively about this 30-year-old premenopause avatar female that we've tried to essentially explain like the ins and outs, soup to nuts, and exactly what this person should do from a health and fitness standpoint. Or explained the complete like ins and outs, like protocol for what they can do from an exercise, health, fitness standpoint. Shifting to the post-menopausal avatar, I talked to you before we recorded about my training history with clients, and I have this female avatar that I've worked with where they are super into health and fitness. They're into the latest trends. They say they're not eating a lot of calories. They're eating healthy. They're eating healthy. They're taking supplements. They're doing all the things. Yet they're still stressed. They're still carrying some body fat that they don't want. They're not feeling energetically optimized. Talk a bit about like what's going on there, and then what are some things that this particular person can do to mitigate these symptoms.
Yeah, so when we hit perimenopause, you have early perimenopause where, like I was talking about earlier, where people are like, I'm not responding to my training very well. What's going on? But the real concern is about 3 to 4 years before that one point in time we call menopause. So menopause is actually one day on the calendar that marks 12 months of no periods. The 3 to 4 years leading up to that is where we see the biggest body composition change, where we start seeing more visceral fat, we start losing our lean mass, we start losing our bone. And then after that one point in time, postmenopause, it carries through a little bit and then it stops. We start seeing better body composition. So when we're talking about your avatar who's like, I'm doing all the things, but I'm still really tired, I'm still holding on to body fat, what's going on? It's because we're having these hormone shifts. So we look at puberty, like I said earlier, and we have girls who start to have all these changes in their bodies when estrogen and progesterone come on board. When we hit the other end and we hit perimenopause, there's all these changes to the body that occur when these hormones start dwindling. So specifically, we lose anabolic stimulus. So we become more anabolically resistant to protein, and we become more anabolically resistant to hypertrophy type training. So when we're looking at a woman who's like, I'm losing lean mass and I'm putting on body fat, what do I do? Immediately look at lifting heavy. So this is where that 85% 1 rep max type work comes into play. And it's all central nervous system driven. As I was talking about earlier about estrogen is so tightly tied to skeletal muscle quality and ability for neuromuscular firing. We have to look at an external stress that is going to help the body adapt how estrogen used to. So that's that heavy lifting. We look at abdominal adiposity or that visceral fat. It's because we're having this change in estrogen and progesterone, and the body's in this really significant sympathetic drive, and we have an elevation in baseline cortisol. So, of course, we see more visceral fat. What do we do there? Plyometrics. Plyometrics super important because it's a really high intense stretch rebound response. From a metabolic standpoint, it's telling the body, hey, we need to not get this visceral fat going. We need more carbohydrate available within the liver and the muscle. And we need to not have this visceral fat because it's extra weight that we don't want because we can't move it as fast as we want. And then when we're looking from like, what do we do for other means of that top end metabolic control? Again, it's a sprint interval training. So if we start implementing training changes and we're looking at polarizing where it's either full gas or it's really slow, easy recovery, never in that moderate intensity stuff, we start to see really good body recomp. The other problem with peri and postmenopause is that sympathetic drive and the neurotransmitter changes that are happening because estrogen is really tied to dopamine and serotonin. We have to look at the gut microbiome. So when we're looking at the gut microbiome and taking care of the gut microbiome, it's really essential because when we start losing our hormones, our sex hormones, we lose diversity in the gut microbiome. We start having more of an obesogenic type gut microbiome. So having an eye to really hammering in the prebiotics, so the leafy veggies, the really fibrous veggies and fruit, and having probiotics through food, not over-the-counter type pills. This increases the diversity of the gut microbiome, which then feeds forward to better serotonin release because 95% of serotonin production is from the gut, not from the brain, which allows us to have better dopamine and serotonin responses. It also allows us to have better BDNF, which is important for our brain and brain volume, which helps with cognition and function. And then having a really diverse gut microbiome also helps with body composition. So the big rocks for peri and postmenopause, again, is the resistance training gut microbiome.
And then from a programming standpoint, I know you mentioned the big rocks as far as exercise are resistance training, compound movements, plyometrics, stuff like that. I know that injury prevention also becomes more important as we get older, whether you're male or female. How does that all play into some of the stuff that you're recommending?
Yeah. And again, when people listen to this, it's like, I don't want people to automatically jump into heavy lifting and plyometrics. We want to take an eye to it as not being a training block, but what are we doing for the rest of our lives? So we phase into it over a longer period of time. So this is where we're doing a lot of mobility work. We're doing a lot of like functional movement, seeing how we're moving. If we're not comfortable jumping, then maybe we do some French contrast training first. So then our body learns how to jump after a heavy load. And then we start to gradually add in some of the heavier type plyometric jump work. Or we can look at battle ropes that gives a plyometric movement without the jump movement. So there are different options to take as we get into it, but I don't want people to automatically change and go, okay, I heard this podcast. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to do plyometrics and heavy lifting. That's not what it's about, because I don't want people to get injured. I want people to look at it as, what am I going to be doing when I'm 80? I'm 45 now. What am I going to be doing when I'm 80? And I want to be hitting the gym. I want to be running upstairs. So let's take care of the body now. Make sure we move really well. Make sure we phase into this different type of training really well. And it might take a month, it might take 6 months until you actually get to the point where you're able to move those loads and do the plyometric work without fear of injury.
Because a lot of these things that you're mentioning are all modifiable, right? You can start with even like a sled push. You can start like doing intervals on an assault bike. You can start the rower. Like these things, for the most part, are all pretty safe for most people to start doing, right? And modifiable based on effort.
Exactly. I always get pushback from women who are in late perimenopause, early postmenopause, because there's a significant increase in wrist, hand, and knee osteoarthritis at this point in time. So people are like, I can't jump. I can't jump. I'm like, well, plyometrics doesn't necessarily mean jump training. It's that explosive movement that you can do through modifications. It can be, plyo push-ups. It can be the battle ropes. It can be, maybe you're stepping up and then soft land jump down. So a low depth box jump or something like that. So just like you're saying, is giving options and modifications so that it can be inclusive for everyone.
And then as far as the prescription for nutrition, you talked about the importance of optimizing the gut microbiome. You also mentioned that protein is more important during this stage because the body doesn't absorb it as well. Talk a bit about like the recommendations for that, and then any other big rocks you'd recommend from a nutrition standpoint.
Yeah, we start to see more insulin resistance. So the types of carbohydrates that you eat really are impactful. So this is why I'm like, you want to reach for the fibrous fruit and veg, because fiber helps offset some of the blood sugar spikes that can happen if you're eating less fibrous or higher fruit sugars or higher sugar fruit. And then when we're talking about protein, the muscle tissue is less responsive to anabolism because we don't have the estrogen help. So when we look at people saying 25 grams post-exercise to get muscle protein synthesis for up to 48 hours, we know that in older women, especially peri and post-menopause, it's 40 grams. So we get that leucine trigger around the 40 gram because of this anabolic resistance. So super important to keep regular doses of protein throughout the day. And people will be like, what, you want me to get 135 to 150 grams of protein a day? That's whoa, so much. I'm not talking about just eating meat. I'm talking about you can have nuts and seeds, legumes, sprouted bread. You can have yogurt. You can have eggs. You can have meat. You can have fish. You can have tempeh, edamame. Just almost everything has a little bit of protein in it. So just with the eye of what you're putting on your plate has some protein in it is going to get you there.
And we talked about some of the things to pay attention to and focus on from the pre-menopause avatar. We talked about like the cycle. We talked about estrogen levels and stuff like that. As far as the peri, the menopausal, the postmenopausal avatar, are there specific markers that you would recommend getting checked every 3 to 6 months? Is there any other like signs and symptoms that they should really pay attention to before consulting a physician? Like what does that look like?
The conversation around menopause is lacking really in society. So, people will be like, oh, I'm really irritable. I must not be getting enough sleep. Or I'm having lots of problems sleeping. I must be highly stressed. And there are no real blood tests to get until like you really start to see changes in your bleed pattern where you're like, whoa, that's kind of weird. Now I'm spotting instead of bleeding and I haven't had a period in 3 months. Maybe I'm amenorrheic. Those are the times to go get checked. The caveat really is if you're having significant symptomology that's interfering with daily life, then talk to your physician about using menopause hormone therapy because it is a therapy and it is designed to help get you through all of the transition. But really note that it does not improve body composition. A lot of people think, oh, I'll go on hormone therapy and then I won't have to worry about my body composition changing. It doesn't do that. It's not the same as your endogenous hormones. Also, as you go into perimenopause, you have a decrease in the sensitivity of your estrogen, progesterone receptors. So when you start whacking your body with high levels of exogenous hormones, it does not do the same as your body's natural production. Also, the metabolism of it is different. Menopause hormone therapy is a therapy, and it is designed to reduce the symptomology, especially when we're talking about vasomotor symptoms and mood disorders and bone mineral density issues. But don't reach for it because of body composition concerns.
Totally makes sense. Last thing I want to ask you is about supplementation. Obviously, supplements are a big thing now. I take supplements. I'm a proponent of supplements, obviously, in situations where your nutrition and everything else is intact, and that's something to kind of enhance all that. What's your opinion on supplementation, and what are some supplements that you might recommend for somebody who's in the first avatar we talked about and somebody in the second avatar that we talked about?
Yeah, I also like supplements. They have a time and a place. I don't like it when people rely solely on supplements instead of a whole food diet. There's a time and place for protein powders, of course, especially if we're trying to get it in time crunch times. If we're looking at performance enhancement type ergogenic aids, then they're specific to what the task is at hand. If you want to use beta alanine because you need more vasodilation for some high intensity work, sweet, but don't use it all the time. If we're looking at things we want to use all the time, then the top three for women would be creatine, because that is something that most women should be having, especially if they tend not to eat meat, because we have 70 to 80% of the stores that men have, and our body uses a lot of it. And so that 1 gram that we produce a day is not enough for all the fast energetics. We need it for gut health, we need it for brain health. And then you can also look at it as also helps muscle performance. The other one is vitamin D, because even if we are out in the sun, a lot of the times we're slip, slap, slop, sunscreen, hat, trying to avoid getting sunburned. So our vitamin D levels are low, and we need that for so many different functions in the body. And then the last one that I tend to have people look at using would be a nootropic. So looking at rhodiola or ashwagandha, because these two adaptogens really help mitigate the sympathetic drive, really help mitigate stress. So for our younger avatar, I would recommend rhodiola rosea. And for our peri and postmenopausal women, I would say ashwagandha.